I am Bobby Nauman. This is April 28th, 1999. This is being recorded at 809 East 27th Street. I'm speaking with Jim Hulce. Please state your name.
Okay, my name is James C. Hulce.
Do I have your permission to interview you?
Yes.
Do I have permission to submit this interview to Marion High School?
Yes.
Do I have your permission to submit this interview to the Marion Public Library?
Yes.
Thank you. So let's get started by telling me about your childhood in Marion.
Okay. I was born to Clifford and Lillian Hulce. I had 4 brothers and a sister. I was born in 1925 in February, and by the time I was 4 years old, the Depression had set in, although that it didn't affect our family because my father had a good job and my mother also. But we lived in a neighborhood. Fortunately to me, it was a mixed neighborhood. We lived with black people, poor people, old people, young people. It was a nice, substantial neighborhood located at 1700 block and Meridian Street in Marion. I went to Clayton School, which was over on 14th, between 13th and 14th on Adams Street. Started there in kindergarten and went through the first 6 grades there. Had a lot of vivid memories. One of my first memories that I have, I think, when I was about 4 years old. I went out in front of the house at 17th Meridian and looked south up towards Meridian Street Hill, which still exists, and I had the idea that Santa Claus lived up there. But at least at that age, I was going beyond my home. I was getting out into the neighborhood. There were a lot of boys and girls in the neighborhood, so that there were many different opportunities to play different types of games and to be with different types of children. So I got a pretty good background about how people treated me and how I treated other people. Also a lot of adults involved because, again, both my parents were away from home during the day, and especially in the summertime, and I and my brothers were left in the care of a 16-year-old aunt, and we felt that we could go beyond our home and do as we pleased. So we did a lot of things. We would go over and swim in the river. We would go junking, where you would take a sack and go up and down the alleys and find pieces of aluminum or bottles or rags. You could sell almost anything at the local junkyard, which had just moved into our neighborhood I think in 1931, run by Meyer and Julian Savesky. And the person who operated the scales was Kenneth Colby, who happened to be going with my aunt. So therefore, I felt that I got quite a few breaks. A lot of bankrupt companies would send things into the junkyard. For example, pulp magazines, G8 and these Battle Aces, and Western stories and things like that, and just hundreds, thousands of them were sent in and piled up in the building, and I would go in there because Kenneth Colby knew me. I'd go in there and sit and read these books and then sneak them home. Maybe in a month's time I might sneak 30 or 40 of them home, and all of us read, and then I thought nothing about tying them with a piece of twine and taking them back over there and putting them on the scales and getting paid for it. I was fascinated watching old Tim, the old gentleman, break up car batteries. At that time, when I was a little kid, car batteries were made out of wood. The casing was made of wood, and very fine cases. They were dovetailed construction, and they held lead plates, and then the acid was poured between them, and Tim would empty it, and I'd watch him, and then he would take the lead plates out, and then they would throw the boxes away. And I imagine today those boxes would be pretty valuable if we had some of them. But that and milk bottles. They brought in thousands of milk bottles because there were the bigger cities were beginning to go to paper cartons or cardboard cartons, and so they no longer use glass. And we, in the evening, we'd go over to the glass place across the street, the junkyard, and climb the fence and steal milk bottles. And we could get 4 cents a piece for them down at 18th Street, Berman's Grocery, Clark's Grocery. That's where we would sell them. And for weeks, we were in the money. Which reminds me, one summer day, we found a nickel slot machine. And boy, there were probably 10 or 12 of us, and we had our pockets stuffed with nickels. And I remember I went home because I lived there across from the junkyard, and I pushed my 2 pockets full of nickels underneath the shed. But some neighbor, we think it was Mrs. Krausauer, saw us and called the police, and the police came out, and they confiscated the slot machine, and then they asked all of us boys to come get together, and we did, and they said that they wanted all those nickels because they were going to have it as evidence. And later, when my father came home and found out about it, he was very angry because he said nobody's going to claim a slot machine, so the same as the police just stole the money from us. But that was just things like that out of my childhood. There in the neighborhood, we could do a lot of things like that. Going to school was an adventure. We walked to school, fall, winter, rain, so on. No buses. We didn't need them. We would walk together like in little gangs from each neighborhood, walk to school, and there you met a lot of people and made friends with them. Games we'd play on the playground, what we called 1, 2, 3 black man, which was where you tagged it. There would be one line and the other line would get down, and then they would run at you and try to run through you. And if you grabbed them and bang, 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 1, 2, 3, then they had to take your place. We also, marbles were, especially when I was in the 5th and 6th grade, marbles were a national pastime in grade school, and we would play marbles. We made square pots to put the marbles in, where a lot of people were making circles, and we had things like lag the line and river and lakes make bad mistakes and all this stuff. And we'd be late getting home for lunch and late coming back to school because we would shoot marbles down in the street down by the curb, because very few cars. You were lucky if a car come by every 10 minutes. So we could do that all the way home and back. It probably was frustrating to teachers and parents both, but it was a part of us growing up. From grade school, I moved into junior high school out at McCullough in January of 36, January of 37. It was a big adventure, again, because it was much further away. Took you a little longer to get there and to get home. You had to find how you're going to do it and so on. Made a lot more friends, became involved in such things as what they called decathlon for boys and pentathlon for girls, 7th and 8th and 9th grade, and they gave medals, gold, silver, and bronze. And I was not too good athletically, so I usually wound up with a bronze medal. That was it for me. When I reached the 9th grade, I loved football, and so I went out for the football team, and I happened to make the Marion High School football team when I was in the 9th grade, still at McCullough, and I had a lot of fun doing those things. Just before the beginning of school in the fall, they had a football camp, which was up at, I think they called it Camp Crosley. It was up northern Indiana. And Marion High School, all of us guys, about 50 some of us, would go up there by bus and stay for a week, and they fed us, and we would practice our plays and on and on. And then at the end, the coaches would, like there might be a school from Kokomo or Anderson or some other place, and we would play each other a scrimmage game. And when finally the high school athletic league found out about it, and they said there would be no more football camp, so that was out. So I only got to go 2 years to football camp. But that was an enjoyable time. Going through high school, I think, let's see, in 1942, when I was a junior, I had the opportunity in the summertime to get a job at Hotel Spencer as a bellhop. They furnished you a uniform. You had to wear a white shirt and a black tie with your uniform. And I felt real proud when they'd tell me to take the mail down to the post office, where it's located now. And I would carry the mail bag, and I felt so proud in my uniform, because there were a lot of sailors from Bunker Hill that would come to Marion all the time, and maybe soldiers home on leave. So I felt like I was doing my part. So things like that. When I was a senior in high school, in January of '43, I had about 37 credits. And I forget how many you needed to graduate, but I had more than enough. So instead of going on to school in the spring, I caught a train out of Marion, and for $6 round trip, I went up to Chicago and I took a test to get into the Navy Air Force, and I passed the test. And they told me to go home and wait until they sent me the papers. So I came back, and I didn't want to go to school. I didn't want to sit around doing nothing. So I checked with the draft board. I asked, I knew 3 of the girls that were on the draft board actually went to my church. And so I asked them for a deferment of 3 months, and they gave me a 3 months deferment. And I went down and got a job at the Anaconda in Marion. I was called a roustabout. I worked from 11 to 7 days a week, 11 in the evening to 7 in the morning. And if I'm not mistaken, I made around $54, and they took about 80 or 83 cents out of it for Social Security, and all the rest of the money was mine. And my mother and dad, they didn't need the money. They let me spend it whatever I wanted to buy. I know at that time portable radios were just coming into use, and I bought one for myself, and I bought one for my father. I bought all kinds of clothes and things and enjoyed myself. And I remember in February, late February, there was a whole busload of boys that were from my class that were going up to Fort Wayne to take and take a test to see if they could get into the Army Air Force up at Bear Field, Fort Wayne. So instead of going to bed one day, I went with them, and they talked me into going in and taking the test with them. So I went in, I took the test, and I passed it. So now I had the Army and the Air Force and the Navy Air Force. One of them was going to have to call me, but it was getting close to the end of my 3 months, and I went to the draft board again, and the girls gave me another deferment. So I got another 3 months deferment. And so it was in June 15th of 43 that I received my papers to go into the Army Air Force. They told me that I was to go down to Indianapolis and train with the hundreds of other guys, and we would be taken to Miami Beach for our basic training. And so that was something that I always recall too. A friend of mine, Dale Hodge, and a girl who was in our class, and his girlfriend, Mary Keitlinger. It was a red convertible, so I got a ride in style down in Indianapolis when I went into the service. When from basic training, we took, I came home on a delay en route. I was going to the 80th College Training Detachment up at Cedar Falls, Iowa, which was the Iowa State Teachers College. And I got up there, must have been in September sometime, and was taking all types of college courses and doing drill and things. But I don't think I was good officer material, because I remember Colonel Leonard, or Major Leonard, he was in charge of about 200 of us, and he had 2 lieutenants. I don't remember their names, but Major Leonard lined us all up the first day and told us, said that we were going to be quarantined for 4 weeks on the campus. No one could leave. And so the first evening, as far as I know, I climbed out a window and walked over to the across the street, and there was a drugstore and a couple other stores there, and there were 2 upperclassmen from the 80th College Training Detachment standing nearby a girl in a red coat. And so I kept watching them, and they just seemed to be standing. So I walked up to this girl, and I introduced myself, told her who I was, and she told me her name was Jean Wildeboer. Said she was waiting on the bus to go home, and I said, well, I'll get on the bus with you and go home with you. So I went and got on the bus with her, and rode to her house, talking to her and so on, and got off the bus and walked her to her home. And she told me, she said, now, when you go back to the campus, she said, Major Leonard drives a Ford station wagon, one of the old wooden Ford station wagon. Said he drives up and down the street tonight. So she said, whenever you see car lights coming, just stand behind the tree. So I did that, and I wasn't quarantined. I took off whenever I wanted to, and I went and did things like that. From there, we were shipped out. I remember November, it had to be because it was snowing, I remember, and we shipped out and were sent to Santa Ana, California. And I recently, at the death of a famous ball player, Joe DiMaggio, I suddenly remembered why about the almost personal contact I had with Joe DiMaggio was because when I was at Santa Ana, we'd get up in the morning about daylight and have to wash and get our athletic clothes on, and we'd all line up out around the platform, and this young guy would drive up in a red convertible, get out and go up on the steps, and it was Joe DiMaggio, and he would lead us for 15, 20 minutes in calisthenics, and then he'd go down, get in his car, and take off. And later in life, I realized that he was probably being protected by the federal government. People would be griping about how come he wasn't in uniform like everybody else, so they gave him a rank of sergeant and put him in uniform, so that he was doing something for the federal government, and he was still able to play ball. They would rather have him play ball and use him for drives and things like that. At Santa Ana, I had received 10 hours of flying time, and they called me before the board and told me that if they had the time, they could make a flyer out of me, but they didn't have the time, and that I was lack of coordination. I couldn't think. I did one thing at a time, and so they washed me out and sent me to Chinook Field in Illinois. And while I was at Chinook Field, Illinois, waiting to be sent somewhere else, they came and asked me if I wanted to take a test to get into an electronics school. So to have something to do, I got in, took the test and in electronics, and I passed the test. And they sent me to Lowry Field in Denver, Colorado. And it was at the beginning, I was working with 50 caliber machine guns, 20 millimeter cannons, learning all about those. But on the side, I was also, I had an instruction manual and teachers who were teaching me about electronics and computer science. These were black boxes and metal boxes, and they had little bitty tubes about an inch high, which were vacuum tubes. And the equipment for this was to operate equipment like a gun turret. I wouldn't be in the gun turret. I would be away from the gun turret. So the gun turret had to be operated electrically in azimuth and in elevation. And it had automatic gun chargers that would charge the guns and so on. And taking this training, and they took us, after about a month, they took us up to the mountains, and in 6x6s, groups of us. And we came up on these, what they called mock-ups. It was an exact copy of a B-29 bomber fuselage with no wings, but it had the turrets on it. It had the dome for the CFC man and the side domes for the gunners. These were big plastic bubbles because found out later that B-29 was the first pressurized aircraft in the world. It would go up to 35,000 feet without us having to have oxygen masks or anything like that. So I became what they called a CFC man, Central Station Fire Control Operator, on a B-29 bomber. I was in charge of all the equipment, the computer boxes for each gun, each turret. That would be the tail turret, the upper aft turret, the upper forward turret, the lower forward turret, and the lower aft turret. That was my responsibility. Take care of it, make sure that there were 4 50 caliber machine guns in the upper forward turret and 2 50 caliber machine guns in the lower forward turret. That's 6. There were 2 in the upper aft turret. That's 8. And there were 2 in the lower aft turret. That's 10. And 2 in the tail turret. So and a 20 millimeter cannon. So there were 12 machine guns and a 20 millimeter cannon, and I was responsible to make sure that equipment worked all the time. So from there, they sent me to a gunnery school down at Buckingham Field near Fort Myers, Florida. And I ran into a strange thing. harking back to telling you that I lived in a mixed neighborhood in the city of Marian. I went to school with black kids. I had friends that were black. I ate in their houses with blacks. And when I was, the first time I left Buckingham Field to go into Fort Myers, I got on a bus. And we were driving down a road, and it's the first time and the last time that I ever recall seeing a chain gang. But there they were black prisoners in their white and black striped suits, and being guarded by 3 or 4 guards that had shotguns, and they had the ball and chains on their ankle. And I was fascinated. I'd never seen anything like that before. And then the bus stopped, and a little old black lady got on the bus, and I was sitting up near the front. And so my parents had instilled in me the idea of being kind to people and so on, and have manners. And to me, it was nothing but good manners. I got up and let her have my seat and went to the back, and the bus driver stopped the bus. And he said, he didn't look at me, but I heard him say out loud, "You can't do that here." And I figured he was talking to me. And the little old lady knew what he meant. She got up and came to the back of the bus. And so from that time, I realized that there are 2 different worlds in the United States. There's a world for the black people and a world for the white people, because when we took trips on trains to go to different towns, we found out that they had white drinking fountains and black drinking fountains, white restrooms and black restrooms, places where only white people could eat, and on and on. And it was a sad thing to realize that in our country, which we call a democracy, that these things were taking place. And we know later on that this was finally rectified greatly by starting about 1964. But to move on, I went from Buckingham Field to Clovis, New Mexico, where I met the people that I was going to be with on my crew. Ernie Mates was a pilot, and Jesse De La Rema, who was a Filipino, was the co-pilot. Charlie Dowse was the navigator. Dave Brady was the engineer. Miller, I can't remember Miller's first name, he was the radio operator. And Victor Beck, he was the bombardier. I was the CFC man, and the right gunner was Tony Palekas, and the left gunner, who was the old man of our group, who was 32 years old, and I was 19, he was the left gunner, and Cal Lormy was the tail gunner. So we were the crew, and we got together, and we flew practice missions out of Clovis, probably for a month or 2. And these missions lasted for 6-8 hours each time. We would fly long distances. They had places in the United States that looked like the same terrain that you would fly over if you were going to bomb something in Japan, and rivers and so on. So they tried to familiarize the pilot and the navigator and so on with the same type of terrain. So we got our flying training in, and then we were sent to a staging area up at Kearney, Nebraska. And this was in December of 44. And we were to wait for our aircraft. And as Christmas approached, they come out with a 350-mile pass. We could all leave Fort Kearney, and you could go as far as 350 miles away. Well, Dave Brady, the flight engineer, and I He lived in Taylorville, Illinois, and I lived in Marion, Indiana, and we got the bright idea, why don't we just walk outside the base and thumb home. It took me about 4 days to get back to Fort Kearney, and I walked into the Master Sergeant's office, and I said, I imagined you were looking for me, and he said, don't you realize that if you hadn't come back, if we hadn't come back, that they'd had to take our place? So one of these people around here would have had to take our place on the crew and go overseas. So they weren't going to throw us in the stockade or anything. So nothing happened to us. We got our B-29, and we took off in they'd had a snowstorm. The next morning, the snow was about 2 feet deep. They cleared the runways. We got on a B-29 and we flew from there down to West Palm Beach, Florida. We landed at West Palm Beach, Florida, and there were about 6 or 8 Jeep loads of guards that came rushing out to surround the plane. And that's the first time we began to realize that a B-29 was something top secret, that they didn't want anybody to find out anything about it. And we went in to be debriefed about flying from Kearney down there, and then we were told that we would be there for 3 days because we had a cracked wing bolt. They didn't want to take any chances. They had to send out to Pratt, Kansas to get another wing bolt. And while we were there, they gave the officers a car and a whack, and they gave the enlisted men a car and a whack, and we got to do whatever we wanted to do. We went deep sea fishing, went carousing around, drinking and things like that. Had a nice, enjoyable time. Then when we took off from West Palm Beach, we flew down to Brinkman Field in Puerto Rico, and from Brinkman Field we flew to Georgetown, British Guiana, and from Georgetown we took off in the morning and flew down over the Amazon River, and the pilot, all of us, to make sure everybody saw it, we circled over the mouth of the Amazon River and found out, and as we flew out, that the force of that 4,000 miles of water pushes mud about 30 miles out into the Atlantic Ocean. And we flew over around that and got to see it. Then we landed at, I think it was Belém in Brazil. And we had to wait until night. They didn't want us to fly over during the daytime because they claimed that there were German submarines spotting to see about these planes and maybe radioing to people. So we flew over at night. So we took off from the Belém, and we flew over the Atlantic Ocean to Africa. We landed in the morning at Accra on the British Gold Coast, and we were there for a day, and then we took off from Accra and we went to Kano, Nigeria, and landed there. Then one thing I remember while we were at Kano, Nigeria, the Kano is a walled city, and the British controlled the area, but they took us into this city. And as we were driving along, before we got to the city, a sight that I always remember, there was a man with a white bed sheet on. We call it a bed sheet. And he was riding a mule, and behind him was his wife, we assume, and she was carrying a bale of hay on her head. And that was a sight that I always remember. From Accra, we went to Khartoum, Egypt, and we were there for a day or so. And I remember we were given the opportunity of getting on I guess they called them dhows. They were a single-sailed vessel, and a wooden vessel, and they'd take us out on the Nile River, and they allowed us to use our 45s and said, shoot at the crocodiles. And you could see the backs of the crocodiles, and we would shoot 45s slugs at the crocodiles, and you could see them bounce off their hide, because I guess their hide must have been over an inch or even 2 inches thick. It was amazing. From Khartoum, we took off in the early morning, and this was our longest ride. I think it took us about 16 hours. We flew from there. We flew down over Saudi Arabia. We flew down over the Arabian Peninsula and across the Indian Ocean, and to our destination, which was Chakulia, India, which was about 120 miles west of Calcutta, up in the hills. And flying over Arabia, hour after hour, we fly about 6,000 or 8,000 feet, a very clear air, and we'd look down and we'd see a little group of palm trees and things, and there would be maybe a little village beside it. And then you wouldn't see anything for maybe an hour, which meant about 300-400 miles away would be another one. And it dawned on me, I was a young kid seeing this, and I said, well, those people are born, they live, and they die right there in that one spot, and they never get out to see anything. And it was an amazing thing to do. You know, your eyes are opened when you see things like that. Well, we got to Chakulia, and we were involved in 7 missions out of Chakulia. We had to fly to places like Singapore. We bombed a huge dry dock there. I think it was called it was called King George II Dry Dock. The Japanese had captured it earlier, and they were using it, and so we sank it. There was an island called Buckham Island, about 5 miles off the coast of Singapore, and it was a huge oil and gasoline depot. We bombed it. Those, and Rangoon, Lord Louis Mountbatten was getting ready to invade Burma from the Indian Ocean side with landing troops. So they were using us in that way, and an amazing thing, most of our outfit that was at Chakulia had left earlier, and they were sent to Tinian Island, and we were there to help Lord Louis Mountbatten start his campaign. And it was amazing. One morning we were asked to get dressed up and shaven and clean up and stand down at the flight line, and we did. And here come Lord Louis Mountbatten down with Colonel Leonard. He was the head of our outfit. He come by and he shook each one of our hands. There were about 5 or 6 crews of B-29 guys. There were 11 of us in a crew, and he shook our hands. That was amazing. Dapper little guy dressed up in a white uniform with all these medals and all that stuff. Then the base was closed, and we got on a train and rode into Calcutta, got on board a 10,000-ton Navy transport, and we're going we went from Calcutta on the Hooghly River down and went to Ceylon, which is at the tip of India, out in the ocean. And then from Ceylon we went up to Perth and Fremantle. We were there 4 days, and we got to go up to we got to do what we wanted to do, so a lot of us got on a train and rode up to Fremantle, which was up on the escarpment. It was about 600 feet above where the harbor of Fremantle was, that Perth was. So we went into Fremantle and stayed there 2 or 3 days, and monkeyed around. And from there we went on around and came to Tinian Island, and we were stationed at Westfield on Tinian Island, and it was, let's see, in June the 15th, we were all told to dress up and shave and shine your shoes, and we met at the theater, and General Hap Arnold, he was the head of the United States Air Force, came, and he gave us our first air medals that we'd earned. And then he told us, he said, there's going to be a 90-day blitz on the Japanese homeland. Said you're going to bomb the center of each target. And he said there are going to be 10 targets of opportunity picked out each day. And by shortwave radio, we are radioing ahead to the Japanese authority the 10 targets of opportunity, so that they will have an opportunity to get the people out of the road if they want to. So we started that, and we began flying missions. Probably we'd fly one mission every 2 to 3 days. We were going on a mission. I know we flew, before the war ended, I had a total of 25 missions. We took off from, we became lead crew at Tinian Island. Colonel Wimple, he was the head of the 45th Bomb Squadron. That was the squadron we were in. Nice guy. You could talk to him. He was a West Point graduate, I remember. Nice guy to talk to. But he went with us on our first mission as a lead crew. He was supposed to check us out. And we, as a lead crew, you would go up about 30 minutes ahead of the rest of the flight. 750 miles from Tinian Island was another little bitty point in the ocean called Iwo Jima. And that was a checkpoint. And you'd fly over Iwo Jima, and then you'd go up, and then you'd be about 100 miles from the Japanese islands, and we would circle off the coast. We had to fly an upwind leg and a downwind leg, and we had to fire phosphorus flares so that the planes coming behind us could see where we were, and they would form up on us, and then we would fly as a group into the target. And we did this, about every time we did this, we were attacked by Japanese fighters, but they were old timers, these Japanese fighters. They didn't risk their necks. They weren't like the young guys who were kamikaze and stuff like that. But what they did would, they would, if we would be flying, there'd be an overcast above us and an overcast underneath us. And we were flying between them, and they would dive down, hoping that they would be diving down so that we would fly into their bullets. But they never hit us. And sometimes they would fly out about 6,000 yards, staying out, because that was the range of our 50 caliber guns. And then they would pour on the coal and fly up maybe 5-6 miles, and then they would come around and they'd come right at us and try to shoot us down. And that was it was an adventure. I thought of it as a kid. I was a kid, and I thought of it as like was shooting ducks in a shooting gallery. And on every mission, I always took a shower and put on clean flight uniform, and I always carried a silver dollar in my pocket. I figured if I was shot down over Japan that some guy would have a souvenir. It never bothered me that way. It was something that we had to do, and we did it. The last 2 missions of the war, I know, they were putting 800 B-29 bombers over Japan each day. And that still wasn't enough, so then we know what happened, I think, on the 6th of August and on the few days later, both at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They dropped the atomic bombs, and that ended it. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't be here, because they had already drawn up the plans and named them. They were expecting 500,000 casualties in taking the Japanese island, and we would have had to fly mission after mission, and how many can you fly without knowing, finally you're in the one that cost you. So that was my war experience. It was great. I'm glad I got to do it. And to me, the wonderful thing about it is that World War II ended in August of 1945. And this coming August 1999, that means for 54 years, we haven't had a world war. And I think that's something to feel good about. We've had limited action, but we haven't had a world war. Maybe mankind is slowly beginning to understand that if we have one more, there won't be anything left. Let's see. I came home and went to work at the brewery in Marian, and I decided that wasn't what I wanted to do, so I went to Ball State, took advantage of the GI Bill, and became a school teacher. And I got a bachelor and a master's from Ball State. I taught in Marian for 35 years and enjoyed every day of it. I love to teach children, and I retired in 1985, and I still enjoy life, and hope I can continue to do that.
So, back in high school, are there any particular memories that you can think of?
Oh yeah, let's see. I and a couple friends of mine, we would work up little ideas like, how could we get out early to beat the kids downtown? They had a place called Farmer's Market, and you could buy stuff at the Farmer's Market. You could buy a complete lunch for 35 cents, bread and butter and all that stuff, what it cost. But you had to get down there, otherwise you'd have to stand in line. And I remember Pop Kendall was the principal in 1940, 41, and I and Dee McDaniel and Dale Hinkle, we would take we would get a pass to go to the library from our teacher, and we knew that Mrs. Johnson, every time you handed Mrs. Johnson a pass, there were about a dozen or 2 dozen kids pushing against her desk, so we'd just stick our arm up over there, and she'd take the pass out of her hand, and then we'd step back, and the first thing you know, we were outside, and we would sneak over to our locker and get our wraps on and take off out the door and out and run down the alley. And one time I remember Pop Kendall in the wintertime caught us, and the poor old guy chased us down the alley through the snow with no coat or anything on. He trying to catch us, but we did silly things like that. Had a lot of fun dating girls. I enjoyed talking to people and going to the movies. In fact, I remember some of us guys in the spring would, instead of we go downtown to eat lunch, and instead of going back to school, we would slip into the Lyric or Moonlight Theater, and you had to hunker down because you knew that Pop Kendall was going to come in and look around to see who who was in there, and he never caught me. That was something I remember. I remember being in the Easter parade, which was a big thing for Marion High School, where the boys, we'd line up and march with flashlights on the Coliseum floor in different types of formations. A big extravaganza, and it was also the Easter parade where one girl was chosen as being the Marion High School queen. In our class, it was Helen May. In our class, I remember class of 43. I guess right now so many things happened. Football games you played, the dances you went to at night at the old YMCA, which was down on 5th and Boot Street. And I know a lot of us guys that talk about it now. You can't believe it. That little place held all those memories, and they had a swimming pool in there and a gym floor, and how they had dances in there on Friday evenings after the ball game. Never understand, but they did. Memories like that. The Halloween parades downtown. That was where you'd meet people from high school. Halloween pranks, going out with your friends and trying to upset outhouses. That was people still didn't have inside toilets, but we did things like that. Soaping the tracks around Halloween time for the streetcars so they couldn't get around the corners, or going out by the cemetery, and when the guy'd get out to turn the trolley around, he just had to pull down the trolley and he'd take it to the back and put it on, and he would switch ends and drive it back that way because he could drive it from either end. And we'd pull the trolley and then he'd have to come back and put it up again. So those were good memories. Other good memories we remember were when the basketball games were played down at the Coliseum, and you'd go down there with your friends. Gangs of you'd walk down the streets before and after the games. There was no traffic. We didn't have the traffic that they have today. And around New Year's, they had these. They'd have midnight movies at the Indiana Theater and the Paramount Theater. You could go and see these movies and come home early in the morning, walking down the street, dozens of kids shouting and hollering at one another. Had no worries about being attacked by anyone or anything. There were no fights, things like that. It was a wonderful time to be young and to enjoy yourself.
Are there any movies you remember being popular back then?
Yeah, the ones with Boris Karloff, Frankenstein movies were very popular. Let's see. Westerns. Those were the westerns that we remembered. Randy Scott and Hoot Gibson and Ken Maynard and Tom Mix. In fact, the first movie I ever saw in my life, I was 7 years old, was Down to Moonlight, when my brother Bob and Downton Eastus took me. It was a silent movie. Yeah, I'll remember that forever. Things like that. It was something. There were 4 theaters in Marion when I grew up. The Moonlight, the Lyric, the Paramount, and the Indiana. And I think Billy Connors ran all four of them. He had an in with Hollywood. He had first showing of pictures here in Marion. People would pay $3 and $4 to see him. He had that kind of pull.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the interview.
Well, I'm glad I could do it. It'll give people an idea of what it was like to grow up from the time just before the Depression, through the Depression, through World War II, and the aftermath. Somewhat was a good time. Before all of the modernity that hit us after World War II, people's love of the automobile, and that did away with the buses, did away with the streetcars, the interurbans, and now we have to solve the problem of what do you do to get people moving from one place to another who don't have transportation. That's a problem that's facing people.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.